What would you do if the town you had called home since the hour you were born gathered on the boardwalk one morning and told you to be gone by sundown? Not for stealing, not for violence, not for any crime a judge would recognize, but for a whisper. A rumor so thin it could not hold its own weight in open air yet, so heavy it pressed the breath out of your life in less than a week. That is what happened to Elise Garland, 22 years old, standing on the planks outside Felton's General Merchandise in Redstone Crossing, Wyoming Territory, on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1882, with her dead mother's Sunday dress buttoned to the throat and her hands folded in front of her, the way her father had taught her to fold them when she meant to keep her dignity in a room that had already decided to take it. The elders stood in a half circle, 7 men. 4 of them had eaten supper at her father's table when her father was alive. 2 of them had borrowed his cross-cut saw and returned it dull. One of them, Emmett Poole, who had shod her father's horses for 15 years, would not meet her eye and had not met it since Friday. In the center of the half circle, one step ahead of the others, stood Silas Felton. He owned the mercantile. He owned the only scale in town. He owned the opinion of every woman who needed ribbon and every man who needed powder, and he had owned those opinions long enough that most of them had forgotten they had ever been their own. Silas Felton was not a tall man. He was not a strong man. He was the kind of man who grows powerful in a small place, the way mold grows powerful in a closed room, quietly in the dark, feeding on what others leave unattended. His voice carried. It always carried. He had the gift of speaking as though he were reading aloud from a document that had already been signed. "Miss Garland," he said, "the town of Redstone Crossing, by the authority of its elders and in the interest of its moral standing, has determined that your continued presence is injurious to the character of this community. You are granted permission to remove yourself to the parcel of land held in your name on the county rolls and to reside there at your own provision. You will depart by sundown. You will take with you what you can carry. You will not return." He said it flat and dry without raising his voice. He did not need to. The street was quiet. The blacksmith's hammer had stopped. A woman on a porch across the road turned her chair so its back faced the street, as though the act of not seeing could keep her hands clean. Elise did not cry. That was one small thing she kept. She had worn her mother's Sunday dress because it was the strongest wool she owned, and because she had decided before dawn that she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her weep into something fine. She had braided her hair tight. She had washed her face with cold water from the basin. She had done these things slowly and with great care, the way a soldier dresses for a battle. He knows he cannot win, but intends to walk into standing. She looked at Silas Felton. She looked at the men behind him. She looked at Emmett Poole, who was studying the grain of the boardwalk as though it contained scripture. She said nothing. There was nothing to say that would not be twisted before it reached the end of the street. A boy brought her trunk from the house. It was not her house anymore. The bank had taken it on Tuesday. By Friday, the whispers had begun. By the following Wednesday, the elders had met in the back room of Felton's Mercantile and decided she was unfit. She did not yet know who had planted the whisper. She had a suspicion, thin as a splinter lodged under the nail, and it pointed at the man who was now handing her a folded piece of paper. The deed. 40 acres of blistered shale, 2 miles past the county line, in a stretch of Badlands the surveyor had marked worthless in ink when her father won it in a card game a decade before. Her father had laughed about it once at supper and never spoken of it again. It was the only property left in her name after the bank took the house, and the elders, in granting her permission to live upon it, had made a great show of mercy, as though they were not sending a girl of 22 into a country that had buried grown men in a season. She took the deed. She put it in her apron pocket. She picked up the leather strap of her trunk and she walked off the boardwalk and into the street. And she did not look back, because looking back is what they expected. And she had decided that morning that she would not give them a single thing they expected. Emmett Poole drove her. He brought the same wagon he used for hauling feed the bed, still smelling of oat dust, and the iron rims still caked with the mud of the creek road. He loaded her trunk without speaking. He climbed onto the box. He clucked to the mule. They rode through town in silence, past the schoolhouse where 2 children at the fence stopped their game, and stared past the church with its crooked steeple, past the last house and the sagging yard fence, and out onto the county road where the pines grew tall and the light came down in long yellow slants through the branches. I took her to the last bend. That was where the pines gave up and the ground turned the color of a struck match. Red, dry, open. He would not take her further. He climbed down and set her trunk on the shoulder of the road and pressed the folded deed into her palm, though she already had it. His hands were shaking. "I am sorry, Miss Garland," he said. "I know," Elise said. "You keep to yourself out there." "I mean to." He climbed back onto the box. The mule turned its head once as if to ask why she was not coming with it. Then Emmett clucked his tongue and the wagon groaned away, and the dust it lifted was the last soft thing she would see for a long while. Elise stood on the road with her trunk at her feet and looked out at what the county had given her. The Badlands opened in front of her like a wound that had refused to heal. Rust-red shale stretched in every direction, broken by wind-scoured ridges and cut through by a single dry watercourse that ran like a black seam through the low hills. No tree tall enough to shade a dog, no smoke on any horizon. The sky above was the pale, indifferent blue of something that had watched a great many people arrive and had not troubled itself to remember any of them. She was 22 years old. Her hands, already at 22, were marked at the knuckles from a life of laundry tubs and butter churns and the long handle of her father's crosscut saw. Her father had been dead a year, her mother 9 years. The house they had built together on the north end of Redstone Crossing had been sold out from under her by the bank on a Tuesday, and by Friday the whispers had found their legs, and by the following Wednesday her life as she had known it was over. She bent. She took the leather strap in both hands. She began to drag her life into the Badlands. She walked until the road behind her was a memory, and the ridges around her had swallowed every human sound. The deed in her apron named a parcel marked by a lone standing stone the surveyor had called, with what she now understood to be casual cruelty, Garland's Rest. She had never seen the parcel. Her father had won it from a drifter in a card game 10 years before, laughed about it at supper, and let it sit in a drawer like a joke he meant to tell again someday, but never did. She found the standing stone at dusk. It leaned out of a low saddle between two red ridges taller than she was, weathered smooth on the windward side. The county surveyor, who had registered the deed in her father's name, had cut a rough G into the stone's face to mark the claim, and the letter had survived whatever years of wind and grit had polished the rest of the stone to nothing. She stood in front of it and put her palm against the carved letter and felt the coolness of the rock against her skin, and she let out a breath she had been holding since Tuesday. Around the stone, in a rough circle, the wind had cleared of dust, lay a scatter of what she took at first for cast-off lumber. Gray planks split by sun, beams half buried in red dirt. The bleached bones of something that might once have been a line shack or a prospector's first try or the beginning of a cabin. Some other exiled soul had started and never finished. The wood was silvered by years. One long beam still bore the black scorch of an old fire. Elise looked at the pile for a long time. Then she looked at the deed in her hand. Then she looked at the sky, which had begun to bruise toward night. "Well," she said aloud to no one, "it is a start." That night she slept in the lee of the standing stone with her trunk for a pillow and her mother's shawl pulled to her chin. She dreamed of her father's voice saying something she could not quite catch. She woke before dawn with a taste of iron in her mouth and a strange, steady certainty in her chest that she had not asked for and could not yet name. She lasted 3 days on what she had. Hardtack from the trunk, water from a seep she found half a mile west of the stone, a thin line of moisture weeping from a crack in the shale into a shallow basin no bigger than a hat brim. She rationed. She chewed slowly. She did not waste. On the 4th morning, she wrapped her mother's silver thimble and a small enamel brooch in a handkerchief, tucked them into her apron beside the deed, and set out on foot toward Redstone Crossing. The walk took most of a day. She came in from the red side where no traveler was expected. 2 children at the schoolhouse fence stopped their game and stared. A woman on a porch turned her chair around. The blacksmith's boy pretended not to see her, though his hammer went still for a full beat as she passed. She went to Felton's Mercantile because there was no other. Silas Felton stood behind his counter in his shirt sleeves, weighing coffee for a rancher. When the bell above the door rang, he looked up. His face did not soften. "Come to beg," he said. "To trade," Elise said. She placed the thimble and the brooch on the counter. He picked them up without haste. He held them to the window light. He turned them. He sniffed as though smelling them, though there was nothing to smell. "Silver plate," he said. "Not silver. It is silver. On my scale it is not." The rancher had stopped weighing his own business to watch. Two women at the ribbon table went still, frozen mid-reach, their fingers hovering over bolts of cloth. Silas set the brooch down. He laughed. It was a short, dry laugh, the kind a man laughs when he wants others to hear. "Nails," he said when she named her list. "Nails for what? Are you building a palace out there among the rattlesnakes?" He looked past her at the women. "The Garland girl has come to build a palace." One of the women covered her mouth. The other did not bother. He weighed the brooch again with the slowness of a man enjoying himself. "I will give you 4 pounds of nails, half a sack of flour, 1 tin of matches, no oil. And you take yourself out of my store before the Reverend hears you are back inside the town line." Elise did not answer. She watched him count the nails into a paper cone with a deliberateness meant to be witnessed. When he pushed the goods across the counter, he pushed them a fraction too hard, and the flour sack tipped and dusted her wrist. "Try not to come back," he said. "It is unkind to make a town remember." She gathered the goods into her arms and walked out. The bell rang behind her like a period at the end of a sentence. She walked through town with the paper cone of nails knocking against her hip and the flour sack sifting a thin white line across her boot. She walked past the mercantile and past the feedlot and past the church and toward the edge of town, where the last houses gave way to scrub and the county road bent south. She was passing behind the bank when she heard the voices. The window was half open. The afternoon heat had pushed it up, and the voices carried through the gap, clean and careless. The voices of men who did not imagine they could be overheard. She would have walked past. She would have kept walking and never known. But the first voice she heard was Silas Felton's, and the sound of it stopped her feet cold. She pressed her back against the clapboard wall. She held the flour and nails to her chest, and she listened. A second voice, younger, thinner, careful. She recognized it. Aldous Felton, Silas's cousin, who worked the counter at the Redstone Savings and Trust, and who had the soft, apologetic manner of a man who knows his position depends on another man's favor. Silas spoke first. "The recording is done. The house is in my name now. Aldous, you filed it clean." "Filed it Tuesday," Aldous said. "Under Harwick. No one will trace it. The girl does not know a Harwick." "She does not need to know a Harwick," Silas said. "She needs to be gone. And she is gone. That is the end of it." A chair scraped. A cup was set down. Aldous said quieter the rumor. "If someone asks where it started." "No one will ask," Silas said. "A rumor only needs a mouth. It does not need a name. And by the time anyone thinks to wonder, the girl will be dead of thirst on that pile of red rock. Or she will have walked to the next territory, and we will never hear the name Garland again." Silence. Then Aldous again, almost whispering, "And if she comes back?" Silas laughed, the same dry laugh. "She came back today. I gave her 4 pounds of nails and sent her out like a dog. She will not come back." Elise stood against the wall with the flour sack pressed against her ribs and the nails biting into her forearm through the paper cone, and she did not move for a long time after the voices stopped. The sun was on her neck. A fly circled the window ledge. Somewhere inside the bank, a drawer opened and closed. She had known. She had known since the boardwalk, since the way Silas had stepped forward one pace ahead of the others, since the speed of the bank, since the rumor arriving fully formed on Friday morning, as though it had been written in advance and placed on the counter like a bill of goods. She had known, but knowing with the body is not the same as knowing with the ears, and now she knew with her ears, and the knowing was a stone in her chest that she could not swallow and could not spit out. She pushed off the wall. She walked. She did not run. Running would have been the wrong thing, and she was learning stride by stride to do the right thing, when every nerve in her body screamed to do the wrong one. At the edge of town, past the last house and the sagging churchyard fence, a small figure sat on an overturned crate beneath a cottonwood. It was Miss Opal, who had been old when Elise was a child and was older now. She lived alone in a leaning shed behind the wheelwright's shop and was said by some to be simple and by others to be the only sane person left in Redstone Crossing. Her hands were folded on a bone-white cane. Her eyes were the color of watered milk. Elise slowed. She did not know why. The old woman lifted her head. "Child," Miss Opal said, "the red ground remembers what the town forgets." Elise opened her mouth. Nothing came out. "Go on now," Miss Opal said. "Do not stand where they can see you pity yourself." Elise went on. She walked the long miles back to Garland's Rest, with the paper cone of nails knocking against her hip, and the flour sack sifting its slow white line, and the old woman's words settling into her chest, where she could not quite reach them to turn them over. She reached the standing stone at moonrise. The wood was as she had left it. She set the nails and flour beside the stone and sat with her back against it until the trembling in her legs stopped. That night she ate a handful of flour mixed with seep water into a rough paste. She drank what was left in her canteen. She slept curled against her trunk with the paper cone of nails at her side like a hoarded treasure. The wind came down the saddle in long, soft rushes that sounded if she let them like breath. The next morning she began. She dragged the buried planks out of the red dirt one at a time, working with her hands in the edge of a flat stone she had pried from the ridge. Her palms bled by noon. She wrapped them in strips torn from her apron and kept working. She sorted the wood into piles, sound, half sound, scorched, splintered. She counted the sound pieces. 14. She counted the half sound. 9. She looked at the count and set her jaw and did not cry, though she thought about it the way a person thinks about stepping off a ledge before deciding against it. By evening, she had cleared the circle around the standing stone. In its center stood a low stack of gray lumber that from any distance would look exactly like what it was. Not enough. She sat in the dust and looked at it. She thought of her father, Wallace Garland, who had built the house on the north end of Redstone Crossing. With his own hands in the winter, he married her mother in a wind a neighbor once said would strip paint from iron. He had told her when she was small that a house was not raised by lumber. It was raised by the arguing of a man with the ground until the ground gave in. She did not sleep in the lee of the standing stone that night. She lay down beside the stack of wood instead. She wanted to be near it. She wanted to learn it. She listened to the wind. She listened to the small rustle of shale sliding down the ridge above her. She listened to a coyote calling from the black seam of the dry watercourse and receiving no answer. She listened to the wood itself, which made small tick and shift sounds as the day's heat left it. At one point, deep in the night, she heard something else. A low, hollow sound, not quite a hum, coming from somewhere under her ear. She sat up. The sound stopped. She lay down and pressed her ear flat to the ground. Nothing. She lay a long while listening for it to return. It did not. She thought in the way a person thinks when very tired and very alone, that the ground beneath her had spoken, and then she thought better of it and closed her eyes. In the morning she rose stiff and slow and began again. She dragged the longest sound beam to the base of the standing stone and stood it upright, leaning it against the stone's smooth side. It was the first post of nothing yet. For 3 days she worked this way, sorting, dragging standing pieces upright, marking with a charred stick where a corner might go. Blisters rose on her palms and broke and rose again. Her mother's Sunday dress went pale with dust at the hem and stiff at the knees. She did not weep. She did not speak. Once when a plank slipped and struck her shin, she said quietly no and went back to work. On the 4th night, she dreamed again of her father's voice. This time she caught a word. It was her own name, said the way he had said it when he was pleased with her. She woke in the dark with her hand pressed flat against the ground, and beneath her palm she felt, or believed she felt, that same low, hollow shift. Faint, slow, steady as a sleeping animal's side. She kept her hand there until the sky began to gray. Then she rose, and without eating, without lighting anything, without straightening her hair, she went to find where the sound was strongest. She walked the cleared circle barefoot on the cold shale. At each step she knelt and pressed her ear to the ground. The red dust held the last of the night's chill and pressed her cheek like tin. At the north edge, nothing. At the south edge, nothing. She circled back. She knelt beside the standing stone and pressed her ear to its base. The stone gave her only the sound of her own pulse. She almost stopped. Then, out of stubbornness rather than reason, she crawled to the place where her bedroll had been and lay flat, arms out, cheek to the ground, exactly as she had lain in the night. It was there. Not a sound so much as the memory of one. A pressure under the ear rather than in it. Faint, slow, steady. She held her breath and it did not go. She rolled her head an inch to the left and it thinned. She rolled it an inch to the right and it thickened. She moved her head along the ground the way a woman moves a lamp along a shelf looking for a dropped needle, and after a long while she found the place where the pressure was strongest. It lay a little east of where her bedroll had been, in a spot no different to the eye than any other, where the shale was thin and the red dirt showed through in a patch about the size of a supper plate. She sat up. She did not dig. She did nothing at all for a long moment except look at that small circle of darker earth. She would come back to it, but not yet. She had no tool for what lay beneath that patch except her hands and the flat stone, and she was learning day by day that the ground did not reward haste. It rewarded staying. That evening, she opened her trunk for the first time since the road. She had not looked inside it since Emmett Poole had set it down on the shoulder. Beneath the folded aprons and the small tin of buttons and the second pair of stockings wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a length of twine lay her father's short-handled prospecting pick. She had forgotten it was there. Wallace Garland had carried it in his belt the year he tried to make a claim on the river above the mill, and had come home laughing at himself, saying the river had more sense than he did. When he died, she had wrapped the pick in oilcloth and set it at the bottom of the trunk because she could not stand to look at it and could not stand to sell it. Now she lifted it out and set it in her lap. The head was iron-pitted with rust, the color of dried blood. One end pointed, one end flattened into a small adze. The handle was hickory worn smooth in the middle, where her father's palm had gripped it 1,000 times. She put her own palm there. It fit. The warmth of the wood, or the memory of warmth, or the wanting of it moved through her hand and up her wrist and settled somewhere behind her ribs. She sat with the pick across her knees until the light went blue and then black. And she felt for the first time since Emmett Poole had left her on the shoulder of the county road that she was not entirely alone on the parcel. The next morning she began the true work. She set the pick against the standing stone at night and took it up each dawn, and it went everywhere she went. When she dragged planks, it lay across the top of the stack. When she walked to the seep, it hung from a loop of apron cord at her hip. When she ate her paste, it rested by her knee. She spoke to it once or twice quietly, saying, "Only come on then," or "Steady now," and the iron head, warm by the day, seemed to answer by being warm. This was the first foolishness she had allowed herself in weeks, and she did not name it as foolishness. She let it be what it was. She laid the first wall along the west side of the standing stone, using the stone itself as one corner and the 4 sound beams as posts. Between them she wedged and lapped and nailed the gray planks, working from the ground up, driving each nail with the flat of the pick head because she had no hammer. The pick was clumsy for the work but not useless. When a nail bent, she straightened it against a stone. When a plank split, she used its halves. By the end of the second day of true work, she had a wall as tall as her shoulder gap, toothed and leaning but standing. She stood back and looked at it and set a start. She was prying loose a long, half-sound plank that had lain buried on the north side of the circle, working the flat stone under one end while she rocked the plank with her knee. The wood came free and turned over in her hands, and on its underside, protected all those years from sun and weather, someone had cut 2 letters with a knife. DH. The letters were rough, made by a hand that had been in a hurry or had been weak, but they were plain. She sat down on the shale with the plank across her knees. DH. Her father's initials had been WG. Her mother's had been CG. She did not know a DH in her family or out of it. She turned the plank over and looked at its weathered topside, and turned it back to the initials and sat with it a long time in the wind. Then she carried the plank to the standing stone and set it apart from the others, leaning it against the smooth face of the stone beneath the chiseled G, and she did not use it in the wall. The letters worked on her the way Miss Opal's words had worked on her, slowly underneath, in a place she could not quite reach. DH had been here. DH had cut wood and started something and carved initials into the underside of a plank where no one would see them unless they turned the wood over. DH had not finished. The question was whether DH had left or had been unable to stay. On the third day of true work, with the wall nearly complete, she decided to look for more. She went to the base of the standing stone to the north side, where the shale met the dirt in a rough seam, and she began to move stones. Small ones at first, then larger ones, flat pieces of shale stacked deliberately, not tumbled by weather, but placed. She knew the difference. Her father had stacked stones the same way around his garden beds. Flat face-up edges aligned the work of a man who meant for the stack to hold. She pulled the stones away one by one, and beneath them found a hollow. It was small, no bigger than a bread box, scooped out of the red dirt and lined on 3 sides with flat shale. Inside lay 2 things. The first was a prospecting chisel iron, rusted almost to nothing, the handle long since rotted away. The second was a folded piece of paper, or what had once been paper. It was brittle and brown, and it fell apart along its creases when she lifted it, but 3 fragments held together long enough for her to read them in the slanting afternoon light. The first fragment said "vein in a hand" she did not recognize. The second said 14 paces west. The third was too faded to read, though she thought one of the marks might have been a D. She sat with the fragments in her palm and the rusted chisel beside her knee, and she looked at the standing stone with its carved G, and at the plank leaned against it with DH cut into its underside, and she thought about all of it together and none of it apart. Someone had been here before her father won the deed. Someone with the initials DH had found this stone and built with this wood and cached tools in this hollow, and written the word vein on a scrap of paper and hidden it beneath a stack of deliberate stones. Someone had measured 14 paces west from something and found something worth noting, and someone had not come back. Elise looked west. 14 paces from the standing stone would put her near the place where the shale thinned and the red dirt showed through, near the patch, near the supper plate of darker ground, near the place where the low hollow shift lived under the skin of the world. She did not go to it. Not yet. She folded the fragments into her apron pocket beside the deed, and she sat with her back against the standing stone and held her father's pick across her knees and watched the light change on the ridge until the red went copper and the copper went gray and the gray went dark. That night she lay with her bedroll pulled tight against the base of the new wall out of the wind, and she kept one hand on the ground. The pressure was there. Some nights it seemed stronger. Some nights it was almost gone. It did not follow the moon or the wind or her own breathing. It was simply there beneath the skin of the world, patient as the world itself. She said into the dark, "I hear you." Then quieter, "I will not tell them yet." She did not know if she was speaking to the ground, or to DH, or to her father, or to herself. She only knew that the words felt true in her mouth, and that was enough. She closed her eyes. The wind came down the saddle in its long, soft rushes. The standing stone stood above her in the dark, holding its carved letter, holding its secrets, holding the plank with DH pressed against its face, like a name whispered into a wall by someone who had wanted to be remembered and had trusted the stone to do the remembering. Elise slept. She slept hard and did not dream. And when she woke before dawn the next morning with the first gray light touching the top of the ridge, and the pick cold against her ribs, and the red dust of the Badlands settled in the creases of her palms, she knew two things she had not known the day Emmett Poole left her on the shoulder of the road. The first was that the ground beneath her was not worthless. The second was that someone had known it long before her, and that someone had paid for the knowing with everything they had. She rose. She went to the seep. She washed her face. She came back to the standing stone and took up the pick and stood for a moment with her hand on the carved G, feeling the coolness of the letter against her palm, the same way she had felt it the first evening, except that now the letter meant something different. It was not just a surveyor's mark. It was not just her father's name pressed into rock. It was a promise, and promises, her father had told her once, are only as strong as the person who refuses to break them. She turned west. She looked at the place where the shale thinned and the darker earth showed through, 14 paces. She counted them in her head. She did not walk them, not yet, but soon. The wind shifted. The ridge above the parcel caught the first of the morning sun and threw it back in a line of pale gold that moved across the shale, like a hand being drawn slowly across a table. The standing stone cast its shadow west, long and narrow, pointing like a finger toward the patch of darker ground. Elise watched the shadow reach. She held the pick. She waited. And somewhere beneath her boots, beneath the shale and the red dust and the patient skin of the world, the low hollow shift went on in its slow, steady rhythm, like the breathing of something very old and very deep that had been waiting a long time to be found. She did not go to the patch that first morning. She went to the wall instead. She had learned something in the days since the standing stone had become her home, and the thing she had learned was this: the ground does not give its secrets to a woman who rushes. It gives them to a woman who stays. Her father had said it differently. He had said that a house was raised by the arguing of a man with the ground until the ground gave in. But he had also said, and she remembered this now with a clarity that surprised her, that the arguing was not done with the hands. It was done with the feet. You argued by planting them. You argued by not leaving. So she planted her feet and she worked. The wall needed a second course along the top where the wind had worried the planks loose in the night. She wedged shale chips between the boards to tighten them. She lashed the post with fresh strips torn from the hem of her second apron, the one she had been saving because the first apron was now nothing but a waistband and a pocket. She weighted the base of the wall with flat stones carried from the ridge one at a time, balanced on her hip the way her mother had carried firewood in from the yard. She worked all that day and into the next. She did not go near the patch. She did not look at it directly, but she was aware of it, a lamp burning in a room she had not yet entered. It was there. It was waiting. And the waiting, she understood, was part of the conversation between herself and the ground. On the second day, she walked the 14 paces. She did it in the late afternoon when the light came low across the saddle and threw long shadows from the ridge. She stood with her back against the standing stone, her shoulder blades touching the carved G, and she faced west. She took one step, then another. She counted each one aloud quietly as her father had counted fence posts when measuring a property line. 1, 2, 3. The shale crunched under her boots. 4, 5, 6. The ground began to change. 7, 8. The red dirt showed through the shale in patches, like skin showing through worn cloth. 9, 10, 11. The patches grew larger. 12, 13. She slowed. 14. She stopped. She looked down. She was standing at the edge of the patch, the supper plate of darker earth. It lay at her feet exactly where she had found it before, except that now she saw it differently because now she had a number attached to it. 14 paces west, the same number DH had written on a scrap of paper and hidden at the base of the standing stone however many years ago. DH had stood where she was standing. DH had counted the same steps. DH had looked down at the same circle of darker ground. The difference was that DH had not come back from whatever happened next. Elise knelt. She did not touch the ground. She only looked. In the raking light of late afternoon, the patch was unmistakable. The dirt inside the rough circle was a shade darker than the dirt outside it. Not by much, a shade heavier. Damp-looking without being damp. She would not have seen it in overhead sun. But in this light, the light that came sideways and low and honest, the circle stood out against the shale like a bruise on pale skin. She took the charred stick from her apron and drew a rough ring around the patch in the dust. She stood and stepped back and looked at the ring and at the standing stone behind her, and at her own hands, which were shaking a little in a way she did not think was fear. She said later. Then she turned and went to the seep and washed her face. She gave herself 2 more days. 2 days of wall work and paste and seep water and the slow, patient rhythm of building something from nothing. 2 days of letting the charcoal ring sit undisturbed in the dust while she carried planks past it and sorted wood beside it and slept within arm's reach of it. She was not afraid of what she would find. She was afraid of finding it too soon before she was ready to protect it. On the morning of the 3rd day, she woke before light and lay with her hand on the ground, and the low hollow shift was there, stronger than she had felt it, steady and slow and deep, and she knew she could not wait any longer. She took up the pick. She went to the charcoal ring. She stood at its edge and looked at the patch of darker dirt inside it. Then she stepped in. The shale gave a small dry sound under her boot. She knelt. She set the flat of the pick head against the ground and pressed. The ground did not answer the way ordinary ground answered. It felt through the iron like the skin over a full water bag rather than the skin over a stone. Something underneath had give to it. Something underneath was not solid. She lifted the pick and swung it once gently, the pointed end down. It bit through the shale crust into red dirt beneath. She swung again. A shard of shale the size of her hand lifted and slid aside. She set it carefully outside the ring. She swung again. The soil beneath the crust was darker still, packed hard by years but not stone. She worked slowly, not fighting the ground but persuading it the way she had watched her father work a stubborn root in the yard. She did not chop. She did not hack. She set the pick point against the earth and leaned her weight into it and let the iron find its own path downward. And when the dirt loosened, she scooped it out with her hands and set it in a neat pile beside the ring. By the time the sun was 2 hands over the ridge, she had a hole the depth of her forearm. Her shoulders burned. Her palms, which had barely healed from the plank work, were bleeding again through the strips of apron cloth. She did not stop. At the bottom of the hole was a shelf of something that was not dirt. She reached down and brushed it with her fingers. It was cool. It was smooth in places and rough in others. It was not shale. It had a grain to it and edges where flakes had been broken away by whatever tool had first touched this place long before her. She brushed more dirt away carefully, as her father had always brushed soil from a root he did not want to break. And as the dirt fell away, the shelf revealed itself inch by inch in the morning light. A dull line of green ran across the shelf like a vein in a leaf. Not the green of grass or moss, a deeper green, almost blue at its edges, the green of something that had been forming in the dark for longer than any person in the territory had been alive. Beside the green running parallel to it was a duller wink of something that caught the morning light without shining and let it go without pride. It did not glitter. It did not flash. It simply was present, impatient, and utterly unconcerned with being noticed. Elise sat back on her heels. She did not know the names of ores the way a mining man would know them, but her father had known them. Wallace Garland had spoken of them once or twice at supper, naming them almost fondly, the way a man speaks of horses he does not own but has admired from a fence rail. Copper had a green that was almost blue. Silver did not glitter unless it was clean. And gold, her father had said once, leaning back in his chair with his coffee in his hand, gold does not need to announce itself. It only needs to be where you are looking. She looked at the green vein. She looked at the duller glint beside it. She looked at them for a long time. Then she set the pick aside. She did not swing again. She lay flat on the shale and put her cheek to the edge of the hole and looked down into it as if searching not for water, but for the depth of the dark beneath. Under her ear, the low, hollow shift was gone, or she could not separate it from the sound of her own blood. The green vein ran east beneath the shelf and disappeared under the shale. She turned her head and looked west. The charcoal ring lay directly between the standing stone and the dry watercourse in a line as straight as a plum string. Whatever this vein was, it had a direction. It had a path. It ran beneath the ground, unseen and essential, and older than anything growing above it. She got up. She walked to the standing stone and put her hand on the carved G. Then she put her hand on the underside of the plank, leaned beside it, the one that said DH. She stood there a while. She said aloud, "You found it first." She did not know if she was speaking to a dead man, or to the ground, or to her father who had carried this land in his pocket like a joke he never finished telling. Then she went back to the hole. She worked quickly now, but not carelessly. She chose a shard of the shelf where the green vein was thickest and the duller glint beside it was most visible. She set the pick point against the edge of the shard and tapped it once, twice, 3 times until a piece the size of 2 fingers broke free and fell into her palm. It was heavier than she expected. The green line ran through it clean and sharp. The duller metal beside it caught the light and held it for a breath and let it go. She wrapped the shard in a strip of apron cloth and put it in her apron pocket beside the deed and the fragments of DH's note. Then she filled the hole. She scooped the dirt back in with her hands and packed it down with her boot. She laid the loose shale across the opening. Over the shale she laid 2 gray planks from the pile. Over the planks she scattered red dust until the surface looked no different from the ground around it. She rubbed out the charcoal ring with the sole of her boot. She went over the area twice, scuffing and smoothing, until not even a careful eye would know that anyone had knelt here. She stood the pick against the standing stone. She went to the seep and washed her face and hands and the back of her neck until the water ran clear. She washed the red dust from under her fingernails. She washed the blood from her palms. She sat beside the seep for a long time with her wet hands in her lap and the shard pressing against her hip through the cloth. She had come to the parcel with a deed the surveyor had called worthless. She sat now above a piece of ground she believed without any man to tell her so was not worthless at all. She thought of Silas Felton weighing the thimble in the window light and calling it plate. She thought of his dry laugh. She thought of the elders on the boardwalk. She thought of Miss Opal under the cottonwood. The red ground remembers what the town forgets. She said into the air, "I hear you." Then quieter, "I will not tell them yet." She went back to the wall. She worked the rest of that day as though nothing had changed because on the surface, nothing had. The shale was the same. The sky was the same. The standing stone was the same. But beneath all of it, beneath the surface of the ground, and beneath the surface of her own stillness, everything was different, and the difference was a weight she carried now in her pocket and in her chest simultaneously, and she could not set either one down. That night she lay against the standing stone with her father's pick across her chest and both hands folded on the hickory where his palm had worn it smooth. She did not close her eyes for a long time. The stars came out one at a time over the ridge patient as nails being driven into a board, and she watched them and thought of all the things she could not yet say aloud, and all the things she would need to do in the days ahead, and all the ways the knowing of what lay beneath her could save her or destroy her, depending on who else came to know it. She slept. She slept hard. She did not dream. The wind came up in the second week. It came from the north off the pine country, and it came dry and loud and mean. Elise woke before dawn to the sound of her wall keening. She went out in her mother's shawl and pressed her hand to the planks. They gave a little under the gusts, but they held. She lashed the tops of the posts to the standing stone with a doubled strip of apron cloth. She weighted the base with shale. She worked in the half-dark with her hair loose and the wind pulling at it. By mid-morning, the sky had gone the color of old iron. The ridge above the parcel bled dust into the air, and the air itself thickened until she could taste grit on her tongue and feel it in the corners of her eyes. She had seen weather like this once in her life. The year she was 14, a dry storm had crossed Redstone Crossing and torn the roof off the livery stable and scattered it across 3 lots. She remembered the sound. She remembered her mother pulling her under the kitchen table and holding her there with both arms while the windows shook. She knew what was coming. She did what she could. She dragged the trunk into the lee of the wall. She wedged the flour sack and the paper cone of nails and the tin of matches beneath the trunk where the wind could not reach them. She checked the hidden patch. The planks she had laid over the filled hole were still in place. She set a heavy stone on top of them. She walked the perimeter of the cleared circle, once touching each post, testing each plank, and then she sat down against the standing stone with the pick in her lap and the shawl over her head, and she waited. The storm broke at noon. It did not rain. It only blew. The wind came down the ridge in a sound like a locomotive, and the shale slid, and the standing stone hummed under her back, a deep vibration she could feel in her teeth. She kept her eyes shut. She kept her mouth shut. She breathed through the wool of the shawl, and the wool tasted of her mother's lavender sachet faintly, as though the smell had been waiting in the fibers for exactly this moment to make itself known. She thought about her father in the winter. He married her mother, arguing with the ground until the ground gave in. She thought about DH, whoever DH had been building in this same saddle with this same wind. She thought about the shard in her apron pocket and whether the wind could take it from her, and decided that it could not because she had her hand on it and she was not going to move her hand. She did not know how long she sat. It might have been an hour. It might have been 3. Time in a storm is not time. It is only endurance measured in breaths. When the wind dropped, it dropped in one long sigh, the way a great animal lies down after running itself out. The air thinned. The dust began to settle. The hum in the standing stone faded to silence. Elise lifted her head. The shawl fell from her hair. She looked at the wall. It was still standing. 2 planks had been torn away and were gone, taken by the wind to wherever the wind takes things it has no use for. One post leaned at an angle that would need correcting. The pile of gray lumber she had not yet used was scattered halfway to the dry watercourse. Her hat, which she had left on the trunk, was gone. But the wall stood, and the standing stone stood, and she stood. She was brushing the dust from her sleeves when she heard a sound that was not the wind. It came from the north, from the direction of the ridge, and it was wrong in a way she recognized immediately. A horse walking unshod on shale, its hooves striking the rock in an uneven rhythm that meant injury or exhaustion or both. She turned. At the north edge of the parcel, coming out of the settling dust, like a figure stepping from smoke, was a bay mare with an empty saddle. The mare was favoring her off forelegs, stepping short on it and swinging wide with each stride. Behind the mare, on foot, dragging one leg and holding the saddle horn with one hand, as though the horse were pulling him rather than the other way, came a man. I was tall and thin. His coat was torn at the shoulder and the sleeve hung loose. There was blood on the side of his face. It came from his temple and ran in a dark line down to his collar, and the collar was soaked with it. He saw her. He saw the wall and the standing stone, and the woman standing in front of them with a pick across her hip and dust in her hair, and he opened his mouth to speak. He said, "Storm." Then he said, "Please." Then his knees gave and he went down on the shale, and his hand slid off the saddle horn, and the mare stopped and stood over him with her head low and her sides heaving. Elise did not think. She set the pick against the stone and went to him. She caught him under the arms as he tipped forward and eased him down onto his side. He was heavier than she expected. His coat smelled of horse sweat and dust and the copper tang of blood. His eyes were open, but they were not seeing her. They were seeing something behind her or above her or inside his own head, and whatever it was not good. She thought of the 4 pounds of nails, the half sack of flour, the tin of matches, no oil, She thought of the 2 miles to the county road and the day's walk to Redstone Crossing and the boardwalk where they had told her to be gone by sundown. She said, all right. She said it to the man and to the ground and to her father and to whoever DH had been and to herself. Then she got her hands under the stranger's shoulders and began to drag him across the shale toward the lee of the wall. He was dead weight. His boots made long furrows in the red dust. She dragged him the last yards on her knees because her legs would not hold her upright, with his weight pulling against her arms. The lee of the wall took the worst of the remaining wind off him, and she lowered him onto the ground and pulled her mother's shawl from her own shoulders and folded it and set it beneath his head. She tore a strip from the hem of her mother's Sunday dress. The dress that had been the strongest wool she owned. The dress she had worn on the boardwalk because she had not wanted to cry into it. She pressed the strip against the cut at his temple and held it there until the bleeding slowed. She tethered the bay mare to the standing stone with a length of apron cord. The mare stood quietly, her injured leg cocked, her head dropped. Elise ran her hand along the mare's foreleg and felt the heat of a strained tendon, but no break. She would heal. She fetched the tin of matches. She struck one against the shale and lit a small fire of splinters and shattered plank inside a ring of stones. She pushed together with her boot. She had so few matches left that each one she struck felt like spending coin she could not earn back. The fire caught. She warmed water from the seep in the tin cup his own canteen had held. She wet his lips. She squeezed a few drops into the corner of his mouth and watched his throat move as he swallowed. She sat with him through the rest of that day and through the whole of that night. She kept the fire alive with scraps of wood. She kept the cloth pressed to his temple when the bleeding started again. She kept the pick across her knees because the Badlands at night were not empty, and a fire drew things that walked on 4 legs as surely as it drew things that walked on 2. Once she heard a coyote on the ridge above the camp, a single high note that hung in the dark and then dropped away. She did not sleep. Near dawn, his eyes found her. They moved first to the standing stone and the carved G, then to her face, then to the wall behind her, then back to her face. His eyes were gray. They were clear now, or clearing. He said yours. Elise said mine. I said thank you. He slept again. But it was different sleep now. The sleep of a body that had decided to mend rather than quit. And she could see the difference in the way his breathing deepened, and the lines around his mouth released their grip, and his hands, which had been clenched at his sides all night, opened slowly and lay flat on the ground. When the sun was up and the wind had gone out of the country entirely, he was able to sit. He sat with his back against the standing stone, his legs stretched out in front of him, his bandaged head tilted against the rock. He took a little of the paste on the end of a finger and made a face that was almost a smile and swallowed it. I told her his name was Judah Wren. He rode circuit for the county land office out of the seat 2 days east. He carried a ledger and a pencil stub and a letter of commission from the territorial clerk, and he traveled the back country once a season, checking claim markers and boundary stones and filing reports that no one in the capital ever read. His horse had bolted from the storm off a low ridge on the north side of the Badlands, and he had been thrown and dragged 20 yards before his boot came free of the stirrup. He had walked. He did not know how far. He owed her his life. Elise only nodded. He stayed 3 days at the wall. On the first day, he mostly slept. On the second day, he sat against the standing stone and watched her work and asked questions she was careful about answering. He asked how long she had been on the parcel. She told him. He asked where she had gotten the lumber. She told him. He asked why she was alone, and she said because the town had sent her alone, and he did not ask further, and she respected him for it. On the second afternoon, he was watching her lift a broken shard of something from her apron pocket and turn it in her hand. She had taken to holding the shard when she sat down to rest, turning it in the light as her father had turned his pipe when thinking. It was a habit she had not noticed forming until it had already formed. He asked to see it. She hesitated. The hesitation was brief, but he caught it, and he said, I am a landman, Miss Garland. I do not take what is not offered. She set the shard in his palm. He held it close to his face. He turned it. He held it up to the light, and where Silas Felton had performed with the thimble at his window, this man was reading. His eyes moved along the green line, and then to the duller glint beside it, and then he looked at her, and then at the ground, and then at her again. His expression held. But something behind it reorganized itself the way furniture shifts in a room when a closed door opens and new light floods in. He said, Child, do you know what this is? Elise said, I know. I was quiet for a long time. He turned the shard once more in his hand, and then he set it back in her palm and closed her fingers around it with both of his hands, the way a man closes a book he has finished reading and does not want anyone else to open. He said you need to file, at the county seat, a proper mineral claim in your name on top of the land deed. Without it, anyone who finds what you have found can stake a competing claim, and the law will side with whoever files first. He paused. The law does not care who found it, it cares who wrote it down. Elise said, I know that too. On the third day, when the bleeding had stopped and his mare was walking sound enough to carry him at a walk, Judah Wren saddled up. Before he mounted, he took a stub of pencil from his coat pocket and a leaf of paper from his ledger, and he wrote out in a small, clean hand the words she would need for a proper filing at the county seat. The form of the claim, the language of the mineral declaration, the name of the clerk who would stamp it. He told her to speak to no one in Redstone Crossing until she had done it. Then he stopped writing and looked at her, and his gray eyes were steady and serious, and he said, there is something else you need to know. He told her carefully, choosing each word before he set it down. In his last circuit, 3 weeks before the storm, he had passed through the county land office to file his quarterly report. While he waited for the clerk, he had looked through the public ledger checking for irregularities, because irregularities in land filings were part of what the territory paid him to notice. He had noticed one. A promissory note had been filed against the 40-acre parcel known as Garland's Rest. The note bore the signature of Wallace Garland, and it claimed that the parcel had been pledged as security for a loan of $60 from the Redstone Savings and Trust. The note was dated 8 months before Wallace Garland's death. If the note was valid, it meant the land was encumbered. It meant the bank held a lien. It meant that Elise's deed was worth less than the paper it was written on because the bank's claim would come first. The name on the bank's side of the note was not Silas Felton. It was Aldous Felton. But Judah Wren had ridden circuit long enough to know that names on paper and hands on the lever were not always the same thing. He said, I do not know if the note is genuine. Elise said it is not. I looked at her. My father kept a ledger, she said. Every loan he took, every dollar he paid, every debt he owed from the day he married my mother to the day he died. He kept it like scripture. If he had pledged 40 acres for $60, there would be a line in that ledger, and there is no line because I have read every page of it. She stopped. She had not read every page of it. She did not know where the ledger was. She had not seen it since her father's death. But she knew in the way she knew the shard in her pocket was not worthless, and the ground beneath her was not empty that her father had not signed that note. She knew it the way a daughter knows her father's hand, and knowing it was enough to say it aloud. Judah Wren mounted his mare. He settled himself carefully in the saddle and gathered the reins. He looked down at her from the horse and he said, I will meet you at the courthouse steps. He said, you saved a stranger. I mean to be the second thing that goes right. He turned the mare east and rode out of the saddle at a walk, his bandaged head catching the late morning sun. At the top of the ridge, he turned once and raised his hand and held it there for a moment, and then he dropped it and rode down the far side and was gone. Elise stood at the standing stone with the pick in her hand and the shard in her pocket, and his words settling into her, the way Miss Opal's had settled heavy and slow and deep in a place she could not quite reach to examine, but could not ignore. Silas Felton, Aldous Felton, a promissory note with her father's signature on it, $60 against 40 acres. She did not need to examine it to know it was a forgery. She needed to prove it was a forgery, and proving and knowing were separated by a distance as wide as the Badlands themselves. She went to the trunk. She opened it. She took everything out piece by piece, the aprons, the tin of buttons, the stockings, the oilcloth that had held the pick. She felt along the bottom of the trunk with her fingertips pressing, testing. The trunk was old. Her father had built it the year she was born. He had built it from pine boards and iron hinges, and he had lined the bottom with cedar strips that still smelled faintly of the tree they had come from. She pressed the cedar strips. They did not give. She pressed along the edges. They did not give. She pressed the center. It gave. Not much, a quarter inch, but a quarter inch in a piece of wood that should not have moved at all. She took the pick and set the pointed end against the seam where the cedar strip met the side of the trunk, and she pried. The strip lifted. Beneath it was a shallow space no deeper than the width of 2 fingers, and in the space wrapped in the same oilcloth her father had used for everything he wanted to keep dry was a leather-bound ledger the size of a hymnal. She lifted it out. She opened it. The pages were covered in her father's hand. small, careful slanting slightly to the right, as though he were leaning into a wind no one else could feel. Columns of figures, dates, names, amounts. Every transaction Wallace Garland had made in the last 20 years of his life recorded in ink that had faded from black to brown, but was still legible. She turned the pages slowly. She read every line. She read the entry for the new roof in 1876 and the entry for the mule he bought in 1878 and the entry for the doctor who attended her mother in 1873 and the entry for the funeral and the entry for the headstone and the entries fewer and smaller for the years after the funeral, when the money thinned and the work grew harder, and the house began to need things he could not afford to give it. She read every page. There was no entry for $60 from the Redstone Savings and Trust. There was no mention of Aldous Felton. There was no mention of the parcel. The only reference to Garland's rest in the entire ledger was a single line dated 1872 that read, 140 acres red ground card game, stake $1 deed filed county, and beneath it in smaller letters, as though he were speaking only to himself, not worth the ride out to see it. Elise closed the ledger. She held it against her chest with both hands. She sat in the lee of the wall with the trunk open beside her, and the cedar strips pried up and the oilcloth lying on the ground, and she held her father's handwriting against her heart, and she did not cry. She had not cried on the boardwalk. She had not cried on the county road. She had not cried in the storm. She did not cry now. She wrapped the ledger in the oilcloth and put it back in the hidden space and pressed the cedar strip down and replaced the stockings and the aprons and the tin of buttons on top of it. She closed the trunk. She stood. A week later, Elise Garland walked out of the Badlands. She walked past the last bend of the county road. She walked past the edge of Redstone Crossing without turning her head past the schoolhouse and the church and the mercantile and the bank, and she kept walking. She walked 2 days east to the county seat in her mother's Sunday dress with the torn hem and the dust at the knees. She carried the shard in her apron beside the deed. She carried the pick in her hand. She carried her father's ledger wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of a canvas sack she had sewn from the remains of her second apron. She did not carry water enough for 2 days, but she found a creek on the second morning and drank from it on her knees and filled the canteen and kept walking. Judah Wren met her on the courthouse steps. He was standing in the shade of the portico with his hat in his hand and a man beside him in a black coat. The man in the black coat was the county assayer. His name was Thorne, and he had a face like a closed ledger, all straight lines and no expression. The kind of face that has spent its life measuring things that other men get excited about, and has decided long ago that excitement is a form of inaccuracy. Elise handed him the shard. He took it into a back room with a small furnace and small scales, and the door closed behind him, and she stood in the corridor with Judah Wren, and neither of them spoke. The clock on the wall above the clerk's window ticked. A fly circled the ceiling. Somewhere in the building a drawer opened and closed. The assayer came out. He set the shard on the counter between them. He looked at Elise and then at Judah and then at Elise again. He said quietly that the vein was silver-bearing copper of a grade he had not seen come out of the Badlands in his working life. He said the words mineral claim, and he said the words filing fee, and he said the words in the name of, and the clerk wrote them down and stamped the paper and asked how to spell her name, and she spelled it for him. Elise Garland, Garland's Rest, 40 acres. Then the clerk paused. He looked at a second ledger open on his desk. He looked up at Elise. He said, there is a note filed against this parcel, a promissory note from the Redstone Savings and Trust. Until the note is resolved, the mineral claim cannot be recorded. He said it without apology and without sympathy, a man reading a rule he did not write and did not intend to question. Judah Wren stepped forward. He asked to see the note. The clerk turned the ledger around. Judah read it. Elise read it over his shoulder. She saw her father's name. She saw the amount. $60. She saw the signature at the bottom, and the signature was close to her father's hand. But it was not her father's hand, because her father crossed his G with a downward stroke, and this G was crossed with an upward stroke. And that was a difference no forger would know to look for, unless he had sat across from Wallace Garland at a kitchen table and watched him sign his name 1,000 times. Elise looked at Judah. Judah looked at the clerk. The clerk said the note had been filed 6 weeks ago. He said the filer's name was Aldous Felton of the Redstone Savings and Trust. He said a hearing could be requested to contest the note, but the hearing would not be scheduled for 21 days, and until then the claim could not be recorded. Elise said, I will be here in 21 days. The clerk wrote it down. Judah walked her to the courthouse steps. They stood in the late afternoon sun, and the shadow of the portico fell across the steps in a line as sharp as a knife edge. And Elise stood on the bright side and Judah stood on the dark side, and neither of them moved for a long moment. He said the note is a forgery. Elise said, I know. I have my father's ledger. Every loan he ever took, every dollar he ever paid. There is no entry for $60 from the Redstone Savings and Trust. Judah nodded slowly. He said, bring the ledger to the hearing. Bring the deed. Bring the shard. And bring yourself, Miss Garland, because in the end, the judge will not be reading the paper. He will be reading the person holding it. He touched the brim of his hat. He turned and walked down the steps and crossed the street to where his mare was tied, and he mounted and looked back at her one more time. He said 21 days. Elise said 21 days. He rode east. She watched him go. Then she turned west and began the long walk back to the Badlands, back to the standing stone with its carved G, back to the wall she had built with her own hands from wood. A dead man had cut in nails a cruel man had sold her at a price, meant to humiliate in a piece of ground the whole territory had written off as worthless. She walked all that day and into the night, and she slept by the creek. She had found that morning and she woke before dawn and walked again. She reached Garland's Rest at dusk on the second day. The standing stone was where she had left it. The wall was where she had left it. The covered patch was undisturbed. The seep was running. She set the canvas sack down beside the trunk. She leaned the pick against the stone. She sat with her back against the wall and looked out at the Badlands going dark, and she counted the days in her head. 21. 3 weeks. In 3 weeks, she would walk back to the county seat and stand in a room full of men and hold up her father's handwriting and say, this is who he was, and this is who I am, and this is what the ground remembers, and you can read it or you can look away, but I will not leave until you have done one or the other. She did not feel afraid. She felt something else, something she did not have a word for yet. It was not courage, because courage is what a person feels when they do not know what is coming. She knew what was coming. She had heard it through the window of the bank. She had read it in the county ledger. She had felt it in the low, hollow shift beneath the ground. Everything that was coming had been coming for a long time, and she was done waiting for it to arrive. She was going to walk out to meet it. The stars came out over the ridge. The wind came down the saddle in its long, soft rushes. The standing stone held its carved letter above her in the dark. And somewhere beneath the shale, beneath the red dirt, beneath the patient skin of the world, the green vein ran on in its slow, silent path, east to west, unbroken waiting. The 21 days passed the way water passes through stone, slowly, without any visible sign of movement. And yet at the end of it, the stone is changed. Elise did not count the days on the wall. She did not scratch marks into the standing stone. She counted them in the work. Each day she built was a day subtracted from the distance between herself and the hearing at the county seat. And each plank she nailed, and each stone she carried, and each nail she drove with the flat of the pick head was a word in the argument she was constructing, not with her mouth, but with her hands. She built the second wall. She built it along the north side of the standing stone, joining it to the first wall at the corner where the stone stood, so that the stone itself was now held between two walls, like a page between the covers of a book. The stone had been here before her. The stone had been here before DH. The stone would be here after she was gone, and she wanted it at the center of whatever she was making, not out of sentiment, but because the stone was the truest thing on the parcel. It did not lean with the wind. It did not bend under weather. It held its carved letter without commentary, without complaint, and without any interest in whether the world chose to notice. She built the third wall along the south side. She was running out of sound wood now and had begun to use the half-sound pieces, splitting them with the pick and fitting the halves together like the teeth of a jaw. Good side out, weak side in, so that the wall presented a face to the weather that was stronger than its heart. She knew this was not ideal. She knew a wind could find the weak grain and work it loose. But she also knew that the wall did not need to stand forever. It needed to stand long enough for her to come back from the county seat with a piece of paper that said the ground was hers. She worked from dawn until the light gave out. She ate her paste. She drank at the seep. She slept against the standing stone with the pick across her chest and her father's ledger hidden in the false bottom of the trunk and the shard wrapped in apron cloth in her pocket. She spoke to no one because there was no one to speak to. She spoke to the pick once quietly saying only steady now, and the iron head said nothing back, which was the correct answer. On the 11th day Miss Opal came. Elise heard the wagon before she saw it. The sound of iron rims on shale carries a long way in the Badlands, where there is nothing to absorb it, and she heard the rattle and creak of a light wagon coming up the dry watercourse from the south a full 10 minutes before it appeared around the base of the smaller ridge. She took the pick from where it leaned against the stone and held it at her side and waited. The wagon was driven by a boy she did not recognize. He was 14 or 15, thin, sun-darkened, wearing a hat too large for his head. Beside him on the seat with her bone-white cane across her knees and a small carpet bag at her feet sat Miss Opal. The boy brought the wagon to a stop at the edge of the cleared circle. Miss Opal got down slowly, 1 foot at a time, the cane finding the ground before the boot did the carpet bag in her other hand, as though it held something she had been carrying for a long time and did not intend to set down until she was certain of where she was. She stood in the red dust and looked at the standing stone. She looked at the carved G. She looked at the plank leaned against the stone with DH cut into its underside. She looked at that plank for a long time. Then she looked at Elise. "The boy is the wheelwright's grandson," she said. "He will come back for me in a week if I am not dead by then." She said it without humor and without self-pity. She said it as plainly as weather. The boy turned the wagon and drove back down the watercourse without a word. Miss Opal watched him. Then she walked to the standing stone and set her carpet bag at its base and put her hand on the carved G, and the gesture was so familiar and so private that Elise felt she was watching something not meant for her eyes. Miss Opal turned the plank over. She looked at the letters. DH. Her thin, bent fingers spotted with age traced the cuts in the wood as if reading a headstone by touch. She said Doran was my brother. Elise did not speak. She stood with the pick at her side and waited because she understood that this was not a conversation she was meant to lead. This was a conversation she was meant to receive. Miss Opal sat down at the base of the standing stone with the plank across her knees and the carpet bag beside her, and she spoke. She spoke slowly, a person who has been holding a story for 30 years and has finally found the room in which to set it down. Doran Hollow had come to the Badlands in 1864. He was 26 years old. He was a prospector, not a good one, not a lucky one, but a stubborn one, which in the mining country was often the same thing as lucky if you lived long enough. He had found the standing stone. He had found the wood. He had begun to build. And one evening in the late summer of that year, digging a post hole at the base of the stone, his shovel had struck something that was not dirt and not shale and not any kind of rock he had seen in his 2 years of wandering the territory. He had dug down. He had found the shelf. He had found the green vein. He had taken a sample and wrapped it in his shirt and walked 3 days to the county seat and shown it to the assayer of that time, a man named Prouty, who had looked at the sample and looked at Doran and looked at the sample again and told him it was the richest copper ore he had seen west of the divide and that the silver content alone would make a man comfortable for the rest of his natural life. Doran had filed a preliminary claim. He had gone to the county surveyor to have the parcel assessed and mapped. The surveyor had come out to the Badlands and looked at the ground and written in his report that the parcel was barren shale of no commercial or agricultural value. Worthless in ink, the same word that would appear on the deed Wallace Garland won 10 years later. Doran had not understood. He had gone back to the surveyor. The surveyor had told him the assessment was final. Doran had argued. The surveyor had not argued back. The surveyor had simply repeated the word worthless, and Doran had left the office knowing he had been talking to a wall that had been paid to stand in his way. 2 weeks later, Doran was dead. A rock slide on the north ridge above his camp. His body was found by a rider passing through. The rider reported it to the county, and the county recorded it as an accident, and the claim lapsed, and the parcel returned to the public rolls, and no one came for it, and no one asked about it. And the wood Doran had cut silvered in the sun, and the tools he had cached at the base of the stone rusted in their hollow, and the standing stone held its carved letter and said nothing because stones do not speak and the dead do not file appeals. Miss Opal had been 19 years old when her brother died. She had not believed it was an accident. She had written letters. She had asked questions. She had been told by men in offices that rock slides happen and that her brother had been unlucky and that she should go home and grieve in the manner appropriate to a woman of her station. She had gone home. She had not stopped asking. But the asking had gone underground as water goes underground in dry country. It did not disappear. It simply found a deeper channel. She had kept Doran's letters. She had kept the letter he wrote her 2 days before he died, in which he described the vein and its location, and the surveyor's strange refusal, and his own determination to go back to the county seat and file again. She had kept his original prospecting notes written in the same small, careful hand that had carved DH into the underside of a plank. She had kept them in the carpet bag for 30 years. She had carried that bag from one rented room to another, from one leaning shed to the next, through 3 decades of living alone on the edge of a town that called her simple, because simplicity was easier to explain than grief. She opened the carpet bag. She took out a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. She unwrapped it. Inside were 2 documents. The first was a letter 4 pages written in a hand that matched the DH on the plank. The second was a sheaf of prospecting notes, measurements and depths and descriptions of color and grade, written with the specificity of a man who knew what he had found and wanted the record to survive, even if he did not. Miss Opal set them on the ground between herself and Elise. She did not hand them over. She set them down with the carefulness of a person placing a gift they do not wish to seem too eager to give. She said, "The red ground remembers. I told you that. Now you know what it remembers." Elise looked at the documents. She looked at the old woman. She looked at the standing stone and the plank and the wall she had built, and the ground beneath her feet where the green vein slept. She said, "Will you come with me to the hearing?" Miss Opal said, "That is why I am here." Elise read the documents that night by the light of a small fire built from the last of the broken planks. She read Doran Hollow's letter to his sister, and the words were plain, and the fear in them was plain, and the hope in them was plain, and all three were written in a steady hand that had not wavered even when the man holding the pencil knew that something was wrong and could not yet name what it was. She read the prospecting notes. She did not understand all of them, but she understood enough. Doran had measured the vein. He had estimated its depth. He had described its color and its grade in terms that matched what she had seen with her own eyes at the bottom of the hole. She had dug 14 paces west of the standing stone. The notes were proof. They were proof that the vein existed in 1864. They were proof that the surveyor had known it existed and had written worthless anyway. They were proof that the word worthless had been a lie written in ink stamped with authority and believed by everyone who came after, because no one had reason to doubt a man with a seal and a title. Until now. Elise wrapped the documents in oilcloth and put them in the trunk beside her father's ledger. She had 2 weapons now: the ledger that proved her father had never signed the promissory note, and the documents that proved the land had been worth something all along, and that the worthlessness written into its history had been manufactured by men who understood that the easiest way to steal a thing is to convince everyone it has no value. She lay against the standing stone that night with the pick across her chest, and Miss Opal sleeping against the wall on a bedroll Elise had made from the last of the apron cloth and the shawl and a folded flour sack. The old woman slept lightly with small sounds, her breath catching and releasing. The bone-white cane lay beside her like a companion that had learned to be still. Elise did not sleep for a long time. She looked at the stars. She thought about Doran Hollow at 26 digging a post hole, striking something that changed everything. She thought about the surveyor writing worthless in his ledger. She thought about the rock slide on the North Ridge and whether a slide can be arranged by a man who knows which stones to move. She thought about Silas Felton listening to her father at the counter of the mercantile, hearing the story of a card game, hearing the name of a parcel, and beginning to calculate. She thought about all the men who had looked at this ground and seen nothing because they had been told to see nothing. And she thought about herself, 22 years old, lying on the ground with a pick that belonged to a dead man and a deed that everyone said was worthless and a shard of copper ore in her pocket that said otherwise. She closed her eyes. She slept. She dreamed of her father's voice, and this time she heard the words clearly. He said, "The ground does not lie, Elise. Only the men who measure it." On the 21st day, Elise walked to the county seat for the second time. She walked beside Miss Opal, who moved slowly, but who did not stop. The old woman walked with her cane striking the road in a steady beat, tap, 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 a clock marking time that could not be turned back. They did not speak much. There was not much left to say that had not already been said in the documents and in the firelight, and in the silence between them that was not empty but full. 2 people in a room thinking the same thought. They reached the county seat on the evening of the second day. Judah Wren met them at the steps of the courthouse. He had a room arranged for them at the boarding house behind the feed store. He had spoken to the clerk. The hearing was set for 10 in the morning. He told them these things standing on the steps in the fading light. And then he looked at Miss Opal for a long moment and said, "You are the sister." Miss Opal said, "I am the sister." Judah nodded once slowly, a man seeing the road on a map he has been studying for a long time. The hearing room was small. It had one window. The light came through the window in a single bar that fell across the floor and divided the room into two halves, one bright and one dark. The judge sat behind a table that was not a bench but served as one. He was old. He had a face like weathered wood, all grain and no polish, and his eyes moved slowly and missed nothing. The clerk sat beside him. The assayer Thorne sat in a chair against the wall with his hands folded and his face closed. Judah Wren stood by the door in his capacity as an officer of the county land office. He had no voice in the proceeding. He was there to observe and to have observed. That was enough. Silas Felton sat on the left side of the room. He had come from Redstone Crossing in a hired buggy. He wore a dark coat she had not seen before, and his hair was combed and his boots were polished, and he looked for the first time since she had known him like a man who was not standing behind a counter. He looked like a man standing in front of a door he was trying very hard to keep closed. Beside him sat Aldous Felton. Aldous was thinner than his cousin and younger, and he had the look of a man who has been told to be somewhere and wishes he were anywhere else. His hands were in his lap. He did not look at Elise. He did not look at anyone. Elise sat on the right side of the room. Miss Opal sat beside her with the carpet bag on the floor between her feet and the cane across her knees. They did not have a lawyer. They did not have a representative. They had themselves and a trunk of documents and a shard of ore wrapped in apron cloth, and the quiet certainty that comes from knowing a thing is true and being willing to say so in a room that has not yet decided whether to listen. The judge opened the proceeding. He read the matter aloud. A promissory note filed by the Redstone Savings and Trust against the parcel known as Garland's Rest. 40 acres in the name of Wallace Garland, deceased. The holder of the deed, Elise Garland, had contested the note. The matter was before the court for resolution. Silas Felton spoke first. He stood and he spoke with the voice of a man accustomed to being believed because he is the one holding the scale. He said the note was genuine. He said Wallace Garland had come to the Redstone Savings and Trust 8 months before his death and had pledged the 40-acre parcel as security for a loan of $60. He said the loan had not been repaid. He said the bank was within its rights to claim the parcel. He set the note on the judge's table. He sat down. The judge looked at the note. He looked at the signature. He looked at Elise. "Hi," said Miss Garland. Elise stood. She stood straight and still with her hands folded in front of her, except that now her hands were not folded to keep her dignity. They were folded because they were holding something. She was holding her father's ledger. She opened it. She set it on the table beside the promissory note. She turned it to the year the note claimed her father had taken the loan. She pointed to the entries. Every loan Wallace Garland had taken in that year was recorded. The amount, the lender, the date, the terms, the repayment. There was no entry for $60 from the Redstone Savings and Trust. There was no entry for any amount from the Redstone Savings and Trust. There was no entry mentioning Aldous Felton or Silas Felton or any Felton at all. She said, "This is my father's ledger. He kept it from the year he married my mother to the year he died. Every dollar he borrowed, every dollar he paid, every debt he owed. If he had pledged 40 acres for $60, there would be a line in this book. There is no line." She paused. The judge was looking at the ledger. His eyes moved along the columns, checking each entry against the next fence post by fence post. She said, "And the signature is wrong." The judge looked up. Elise pointed to the bottom of the promissory note where her father's name was written. She said, "My father crossed his G with a downward stroke. He had done it that way his whole life. It is how he taught me to write my own name. The G on this note is crossed with an upward stroke. It is close. It is not his hand." She opened the ledger to a page where her father had signed his full name at the bottom of a yearly summary. She set it beside the promissory note. The two signatures lay side by side on the table. The G in the ledger swept down. The G on the note swept up. The difference was small. A person who had never watched Wallace Garland write would not have seen it. But a person who had sat across from him at the kitchen table for 22 years, watching him sign receipts and ledger entries, and the occasional letter to a cousin in Missouri, would see it immediately. The judge saw it. He looked at the two signatures for a long time. He did not speak. He looked at Silas Felton. Silas Felton was looking at the window. Elise was not finished. She reached into the carpet bag at Miss Opal's feet and took out the oilcloth bundle. She unwrapped it. She set the documents on the table beside the ledger. She said, "There is more." She told the judge about Doran Hollow. She told it simply, without decoration, without anger, without anything but the plain sequence of events laid out in the order they had occurred. A man named Doran Hollow had prospected this parcel in 1864. He had found a mineral vein of significant value. He had filed a preliminary claim. The county surveyor had assessed the parcel as worthless. Doran Hollow had died in a rockslide 2 weeks after disputing the assessment. His claim had lapsed. The parcel had returned to the public rolls and had been marked worthless in every document thereafter. She set Doran's letter on the table. She set his prospecting notes beside it. She said, "These are the records of the man who found the vein before me. His measurements match what I found when I dug in the same place he described. The surveyor's assessment was false. The land was never worthless. It was called worthless so that no one would look at it again." She paused. She said, "And no one did look at it again, until my father won it in a card game and laughed about it at supper and put the deed in a drawer. And no one would have looked at it after that, except that Silas Felton heard my father speak of it and decided the easiest way to get the house he wanted was to send a girl to a place everyone believed would kill her." She stopped. She did not say anything more. She had said what she came to say. She sat down. The room was quiet. The bar of light from the window had moved across the floor during the hearing and now fell across the table where the documents lay. The promissory note and the ledger and the letter and the prospecting notes, all of them lit by the same light, all of them saying the same thing in different hands across different decades. The judge looked at the documents for a long time. He looked at Silas Felton. He looked at Aldous Felton, who had not spoken and who was now staring at his own hands as if they belonged to someone he no longer wished to know. I looked at Elise. He said, "The promissory note filed by the Redstone Savings and Trust is inconsistent with the records presented by the claimant. The signature does not match the established hand of the deceased. The court finds the note to be without merit. The deed held by Elise Garland is valid and unencumbered. The mineral claim filed by Elise Garland is hereby recorded in full." He stamped the paper. The sound of the stamp in the small room was louder than any word that had been spoken. The clerk wrote. The assayer Thorne uncrossed his arms for the first time since the hearing began and recrossed them, which was the closest thing to an expression Elise had seen on his face. Silas Felton stood. He did not look at Elise. He did not look at the judge. He walked to the door and opened it and walked through it, and Aldous followed him 2 steps behind, smaller than his cousin, and getting smaller with every step. Judah Wren stepped away from the wall. He looked at Elise. He did not smile. He was not a man who smiled easily. But something in his face released a tension that had been holding for weeks, finally letting go. He said, "That is the second thing." Elise said, "Yes, it is. Word does not stay in the courthouse. It never has." By the time Elise and Miss Opal walked back to the Badlands, riders were already turning off the county road at the last bend, the same bend where Emmett Poole had set her trunk down on the shoulder and could not meet her eye. By the end of the first week, there were tents on the ridge above the wall. A smith was setting up an anvil under a canvas fly. A woman was selling coffee out of a wagon. 2 men from a mining concern in the territorial capital rode in with a folded offer in a leather case and rode out again with Elise's quiet refusal in their ears. She did not sell. She hired. She paid in coin and she paid fair, and she hired men who would work and sent away men who would not. And she did both with the same voice level, clear no louder than it needed to be, and the men who stayed spoke of her at their fires in the evenings as a woman who did not raise her voice because she did not need to. The cut opened on this ridge above the standing stone. The ore came out red and green and heavy, carried down the slope in buckets and crates and canvas bags, and it went east in wagons to the smelter at the territorial seat, and the receipts came back, and the numbers on the receipts were numbers Elise had never seen attached to her own name. By the end of that year, the books at the county seat recorded Elise Garland as the wealthiest claim holder in the district, and the books did not know the half of it because the books could not weigh a wall raised by hand in a wind, or a stranger dragged out of a storm, or a father's pick set against a stone at dusk. The chorus in Redstone Crossing went quiet. Then it went low. Then it turned. The 2 children at the schoolhouse fence came out to the county road to watch the wagons go by. The woman who had turned her chair around turned it back. The blacksmith's boy, who had pretended not to see Elise the day she came to trade, asked to be taken on at the cut and was. Old Emmett Poole drove out to Garland's Rest one afternoon in the same wagon he had used to carry her out of Redstone Crossing. The same wagon with the iron rims and the oat dust smell, and the mule that had turned its head once, as if to ask why she was not coming back. He climbed down slowly. He stood with his hat in his hands. He was older than he had been in the spring, or he looked older. Perhaps the spring had aged them all. I said I should have taken you further that day. Elise looked at him. She looked at the hat in his hands, and the way his fingers worked the brim, and the way his eyes, which had not met hers on the county road, met hers now with the full weight of a shame he had been carrying for months. She said you went as far as you could. She poured him coffee. He drank it standing beside the wagon, looking at the cabin rising around the standing stone, and he did not say anything more, and she did not need him to. He finished the coffee. He set the cup on the wagon gate. He put his hat back on. He climbed onto the box and clucked to the mule and drove away, and this time the mule did not turn its head. Silas Felton came on foot. He came alone. He came in the middle of a weekday afternoon when the men were on the ridge and the camp was quiet, and the only sounds were the wind in the canvas and the distant ring of hammers on stone. He walked up the watercourse from the south, and Elise saw him coming from a long way off because the Badlands hide nothing from a person who is watching. She met him at the wall. She stood inside it. He stood outside. He did not step past the threshold. He held his hat. He was smaller than she remembered, or the wall was larger, or she was. "Hi," said Miss Garland. She waited. He said I was wrong in the weighing. He did not say more than that. He did not apologize for the boardwalk. He did not apologize for the rumor. He did not apologize for the promissory note, or for Aldous, or for the house on the north end of Redstone Crossing that he had taken from her through a cousin and a lie. He said he was wrong in the weighing, and the weighing was everything, and he knew it, and she knew he knew it. Elise looked at him a long moment carefully, without rushing, measuring what was there against what was missing. She said, "Go home, Mr. Felton." I went. He put his hat on and turned and walked down the watercourse and did not look back, and Elise watched him until he was a small dark shape against the red shale, and then until he was nothing at all. He was not a loud man in Redstone Crossing after that. He kept his counter. The town let him keep it. But the town remembered, and the remembering was its own kind of ledger, one that could not be doctored by a cousin at a bank. Miss Opal stayed. She stayed through the building of the cabin and through the first season of the cut and through the long summer when the Badlands turned white in the overhead sun, and the only shade was the shade the walls made. She sat by the window of the finished cabin with her cane across her lap and her eyes half closed, and she did not speak often, but when she spoke, the words had the weight of stones set down in their final place. The cabin grew around the standing stone the way a tree grows around a fence post it has decided to claim. 3 rooms, a good roof of pine boards shipped from the mill town in the valley, a stove that drew clean and did not smoke. The standing stone stood in the main room, its carved G facing the door, and the first wall Elise had built was still there inside the cabin, incorporated into the new walls, as a first draft is incorporated into a finished letter. It was gap-toothed and leaning, and it was not beautiful, but it was standing, and standing was what mattered. The plank with DH cut into its underside leaned against the standing stone where Elise had placed it the first week. She had never used it for lumber. She had never considered using it. It leaned there not as a memorial, but as a conversation between a man who had found something and a woman who had found it again, separated by 18 years, and a rock slide and a word written in ink by a man with a seal who had been paid to lie. The bay mare which Judah Wren had left with her the second time he came through on his circuit grazed loose in the flat between the wall and the seep. Judah came by every season now. He came in his capacity as an officer of the county land office, and he checked the claim markers and filed his reports and drank coffee at her table and spoke to Miss Opal with the careful respect of a man who understands that some debts are owed not to the living, but to the dead through the living. He did not stay long. He did not need to. He had done what he had said he would do. He had been the second thing that went right. On an evening in the late part of the following autumn, when the light on the Badlands went the color of hammered copper. For the hour before dark, Elise walked out from the finished cabin with her father's short-handled prospecting pick in her hand and stood at the base of the standing stone. The cabin was behind her, 3 rooms and a good roof and a stove that drew clean. Miss Opal sat inside by the window with her cane across her lap and her milky eyes half closed, listening to the sounds of the camp settling for the evening with a patience that had outlasted the men who had tried to bury what she knew. On the ridge above, the last of the day's men were coming down off the cut. Their voices carried thin and easy on the cooling air. Lanterns were being lit in the tents. The smith's fire glowed under its canvas fly. The smell of coffee and frying meat drifted down the slope and mixed with the smell of shale dust and the faint mineral tang that rose from the ground when the rock gave up the day's heat. The bay mare grazed in the flat. The seep ran its thin, bright line into the basin. The wind was gentle. The shale gave off its warmth in a long, slow breath. Elise set her palm on the carved G. She held it there. The stone was warm from the day's sun, and the warmth moved through her hand, not as heat, but as presence, as the sense of something held and kept and not let go. She put her hand on the underside of the plank, leaned against the stone. She felt the rough cuts of the letters. D.H. She thought of Doran Hollow at 26 alone in the same saddle with a chisel and a hope and a vein of green running beneath his feet. She thought of Miss Opal at 19 receiving the letter that would become the carpet bag, that would become the hearing, that would become this evening. She thought of the long chain of keeping that had brought the truth from Doran's hand to Opal's bag, to this cabin built around the stone that held both their letters. She put her hand on the smooth hickory of the pick handle in the place where her father's palm had worn it. She thought of Wallace Garland laughing at supper about a card game and a piece of nothing he had won. She thought of his ledger with its careful columns and its slanting hand. She thought of the false bottom of the trunk he had built the year she was born and the cedar strips that still smelled of the tree. He had kept the ledger hidden because he had been a careful man, and careful men put important things where only the people who know them well enough to look will find them. She stood a long time at the stone. The copper light on the ridge changed to gold, and the gold changed to rose, and the rose deepened toward the color of the shale itself. Red on red until the land and the light were the same thing, and the difference between the ground and the sky was only a line drawn by the eye and not by the world. She thought of the boardwalk at sundown. She thought of Emmett Poole setting her trunk on the shoulder of the road. She thought of the paper cone of nails knocking at her hip. She thought of Miss Opal under the cottonwood. She thought of the low, hollow shift beneath the ground on the fourth night. She thought of a stranger on his knees in the settling dust, saying please with blood on his face. She thought of the judge's stamp in the small, bright room at the county seat. She thought of Silas Felton standing outside the wall with his hat in his hands and the word weighing on his lips like a coin he could not spend. She did not think of herself as rich. The word did not fit the shape of what she had. What she had was not a fortune. It was a place she had dragged herself to in the dust. A place she had built a wall around with bleeding hands and bent nails and a pick that was never meant for carpentry. A place the ground had given her because she had been willing to listen to it when no one else was, and because she had stayed when staying was the hardest thing she had ever done, and the only thing she could not afford not to do. A young hand new to the cut came down the slope from the ridge. He was carrying his tools over his shoulder, and his boots were red with dust, and he was whistling something low and tuneless that stopped when he saw her standing at the stone. He slowed. He took his hat off. He stood a respectful distance away, and he looked at the cabin and the wall inside the cabin, and the standing stone that was still one of its corners, and the plank leaned there that had never been cut down for lumber. He said, "Ma'am, if you don't mind my asking, what did you build out here?" Elise looked at the cabin. She looked at the wall she had raised with her own hands in a wind that had tried to take it back. She looked at the standing stone with its carved letter. She looked at the plank with its carved letters. She looked at the pick in her hand, her father's pick, the iron head, the color of dried blood, the hickory handle worn smooth in the middle, where two palms now had rested his and then hers. She said quietly, "A place that would not turn me out." The hand nodded as though he had heard the whole of it in those 8 words and understood it and would not ask again. He put his hat back on and went down to his supper. Elise stayed at the stone until the copper light on the ridge went blue and the blue went gray, and the gray went the deep dark of a sky that had watched a great many people come and go, and had this time troubled itself to remember one of them. Then she went inside where Miss Opal had lit the lamp, and she set the pick against the standing stone in the corner of the room where it always stood, and she closed the door against the coming dark. And the dark did not mind because the dark had learned by now that the door would open again in the morning, and the woman behind it would still be there, and the ground beneath her would still be holding what it had always held. patient and deep and unannounced, waiting for no one's permission to be what it was.